if you're a gig and bass player these days, you're probably finding yourself having to do a lot of gigs with a set of these in-ear monitors. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. Maybe you're doing a lot of gigs with like backing tracks and click tracks where you have to hear something in your ears, or maybe you have a talk back like the singer's talking to you or the band leader's talking to you. Or some bands just like to have a quiet stage. It makes it easier for front of house to mix, and the last thing you want to do is piss off your sound engineer at the gig. I've seen a lot of bass players talk about this, and I've went through this as well. It could be pretty bad playing bass on in-ear monitors. Like, there's so much you lose, it feels so unnatural. So I'm going to talk about 4 things I do to make my in-ear monitor experience a little bit better. So good to the point that actually now I almost prefer playing in-ear monitor gigs than to playing a regular gig with just wedges and a bass amp. So my first tip is get yourself some really good quality in-ears. As bass players, we're playing in the bass frequencies. And if you have in-ears that don't recreate those frequencies well or muddy them up with other frequencies, you're never going to be able to have a good mix, and it's always going to feel like something's missing. I typically suggest any sort of in-ears that have a couple drivers in them, that's little mini speakers inside, kind of like how your best sound quality comes from having like a set of top speakers and a separate subwoofer. Same thing, having a couple drivers in your in-ears is going to make your listening experience a little better, and you're going to be able to hear things a lot clearer. Now, when I started playing with in-ears, this was ludicrously expensive. So this is my first kind of professional quality set of in-ears here, these West Tones. Forget what the model number is, I'll put up on the screen. These cost these days about $500 or so. I think I got them for like $300 a couple of years ago. Actually, about like 5 or 6 years ago. Wow, time flies. But these are dual driver in-ears, so there's 2 speakers inside of each earpiece. And they did the job fine, but they're really expensive for what you get. Skip forward to today. My main set of in-ears are these KZ ZS10s. I don't know if you can see that there. These in-ears, even after I upgraded the cable, upgraded the ear tips, and bought myself a nice little carrying case, all of that package still comes in at about maybe 130 Canadian or so. And these are so good that when I started using them, my band members actually had to remind me to turn my amp on because I legit just thought it was on because they sounded that good. So yeah, good news is you don't have to break the bank these days to get good quality in-ears as a bass player. My second tip is start to think about your direct sound. So if you're like me and you grew up, playing through a bass amp in a room, you're hearing your bass into the amp, out the speaker, traveling a couple feet up to your ears, and it probably sounds great. Bass amps sound wonderful. But when we're playing on in-ears, you're likely going direct, and you're probably losing a lot of the character of that amp and speaker and all that along the way. For example, this is my bass just straight into my interface, all my pedals off. And it sounds fine. A lot of people like DI bass tones. A lot of the Wolfpack records were recorded DI. A lot of famous Motown records, a lot of stuff like that was recorded DI. But if you're playing and you notice it doesn't feel natural, it doesn't feel like how I'm used to, especially if you're playing genres like rock or metal, you're going to have to reintroduce all that amp tone back into your signal chain somewhere. So one of the easiest ways to do it is with something like a preamp pedal. I got this Sanzen Bass DI here. I got a really old video of me talking about this. But lots of companies make these. Almost every amp company even has a pedal board DI based on their famous amps, like Aguilar has them, Ampeg. On my board, I did a video recently talking about the Dark Glass Microtubes X Ultra that I use. And when I turn on the cab sim, it sounds a lot more like a real amp. Also with my compressor, I can add a bit of character there. Now it's starting to sound more and more like a real amp. Add a little grit. So that's one way you can get a bit more of that amp character back into your signal with a couple pedals. Another really obvious way you can do this is a lot of bass amps, like my Mark bass amp here, actually has on the back, hidden underneath this strap, a DI out. which once again, that will take some of the settings you have in the front of the amp. In this case, there is a MIDI tube built in here. I got EQ and all that. It'll put some of that character back into your sound. Now, this amp doesn't have cab sim built in, but a lot of modern amps do. Like, a lot of the new Dark Glass lineup of amps have that. The new Aguilar amps have that. And I'm sure more amp companies are going to follow suit. But once again, that's if you even want the cab sim. You might be happy with just the amp sim and that's it. My third tip is to make sure you're practicing with that rig. Now, admittedly, there are times I plug a cable straight into my interface and just throw my headphones on, or, sometimes like I might just plug into my amp and play that way. But part of the thing that's going to help you get comfortable is using the same rig to practice that you're going to use live. So for example, when I'm at home, I'll dial in sounds that work for me with my pedals plugged into these exact in-ears, so that when I get to the gig, I'm used to how all of those pedals and all those settings react to my particular way of playing. I'm used to how it sounds through these in-ears. And you're going to notice things like, for example, on in-ears, you're going to notice a lot more detail that might get obscured by an amp sending air through a room. You're going to hear a lot more of this, kind of that sort of thing a lot more. And trust me, when you go out to the front of house and listen, that's the sound that they're going to hear out there, not your amp. So if you get used to playing that way at home, getting used to how your rig feels, then when you're on the gig, you're not sitting there thinking about like, why is nothing sound right, this and that. You're standing up there focused on, how to play the music and how to interact with the audience and, be an entertainer. And ironically, the flip side is true too. I actually had a gig with my punk band last month where I knew there was going to be no in-ear monitors, everything was just going to be amps on the stage, blasting the crowd. And for that gig, I actually did the opposite. I didn't practice on ears. I practiced through an amp and cabinet every day to get used to how that feels. So that once again, when I'm on stage, I'm used to how my amp reacts to the way I play. I'm used to how that sounds in a room. I could just focus on having a good time up there with my bandmates. So that transitions actually nicely into my fourth tip, was just bring an amp. If you're finding that, you're practicing through your rig a lot, you got good sound, you're used to your in-ears, and there's still a little something missing, you're probably missing that feeling of like amps pushing air around you. Especially as a bass player, even though we're talking about like all direct setups with no amps and silent stages, oftentimes you could get away with bringing a bass amp with you. Sometimes this is usually helpful. Like let's say you're playing a small room that doesn't have subwoofers as part of their PA system. Your bass amp actually might be needed to push a little bit of air in that situation. Also, sometimes when you're on really, really big stages, the sound system's so far away from you standing at the back near the drummer that it could kind of feel dead. And having an amp just to push a little air makes it feel a little more natural. The nice thing with that too is when you combine it with in-ear monitors, you usually don't need that big of an amp. Typically, if you're playing a no in-ears show, you're just relying on your amp for sound. Oftentimes you have to have that thing absolutely dimed to be able to hear yourself over the drummer or the guitar players and this and that. But already with in-ears, hearing yourself is a given. Sometimes actually you can hear yourself a little too much, going back to this kind of thing. So when you're turning your amp up on stage, you don't have to dime it to get it louder than everyone else. You just have to give enough sound just to push a little air and bring a bit of that natural feeling back. I was actually doing a gig last weekend where during sound check, we got my amp turned up to a volume that helped fill out the room, helped the band feel comfortable. And I kid you not, in between sets, the volume of my amp was pretty much equal, if not less, to the sound of people just talking in the room. Like that's how little sound you need. And when you need that little sound, you don't need a massive 810 cabinet. I'll show it in some B-roll, but you could just, I have a Hartke 210 amp. You could probably even go smaller than that. So if you're transitioning into playing bass on the ears for the first time, let me know what you thought of this video, if you got any use out of it, if there's anything you think I missed, and if anything this video raises bigger questions that you want answered or you want to hear me talk about. Just let me know in the comments. I'm more happy to consider questions in future videos. Anyways, thanks for watching and have fun playing out there. Bye.